Today we're going to be looking at the 7 most feared commanders in the entire format and their decks.
I'm Mia, and I love cute little characters.
I'm BZ. I hate waiting 40 minutes after I get knocked out of a commander game, and fortunately today we're sponsored by Doomlings.
Doomlings is a quick strategy game that only takes 20 to 40 minutes to play. It supports 2 to 6 friends, has cute art, and this is perfect to jam in between commander games.
So we've already tried this game out. We've played it like 5 or 6 times now. After the first time, we really got a hang of it. It's not that hard to learn, and there's some cool synergies and stuff. So as I started seeing cards again, I was like, oh, I can swap this and do this. So it was pretty fun.
There are so many ways to build points, get traits, or steal others before the world ends.
If you want to try the game, you can get 20% off until January 31st by using code NERDS at checkout. Use the link in the description to give Doomlings a shot.
We're also sponsored by Card Kingdom, the best place online to buy singles, doubles, triples, boxes, all the types of Magic the Gathering stuff. Plus, if you use the link in the description below, you can not only see our faces, but it helps support the channel if you make a purchase.
The best place to buy cards already, and you support us at the same time without spending any extra money. I mean, that feels pretty good to me. We're also sponsored by Moxfield, but not yet. Settle down. It'll come. It always does. You won't be able to guess when it comes, but that's fine. Also, Dragon Shield, they have the best sleeves in the multiverse.
Good sleeves.
You usually don't do that part, but I'm making you do it this time because if you use code
NERDS,
you save 5%, and you worked hard for your money, so why waste it by not using code
NERDS,
when you can just use code
NERDS. We're also sponsored by ourselves and you guys. This is patreon.com, the best place online where you can help support the channel and get some cool stuff in return, like watching gameplay with us and friends, and also reviews of your personal decks. But today, we are talking about the 7 most feared commanders in the entire format.
This means that when you sit down for a game of Commander, before the game even begins, as soon as your opponent reveals their commander, there are like things you need to think about, actions you might need to take in the game. This is going to affect your mulligans because this commander is so demanding of your attention in some way. They're definitely worth being scared of even before the game starts. And then obviously, once we get into the game, they're just as scary. But I think very few commanders can crack into this, for me especially. When I see it, I'm scared of it immediately, even before we draw our hands.
It takes a lot. It makes me rethink what I'm allowed to keep and whether I need to just put it back and try something else. If this hand is okay against certain commanders, this one is not fast enough for the commanders we have listed.
Let's get it started. What's the first one? It's a commander I play against a lot.
It's Edgar Markov, 3 black, white, red for a 4/4. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if he's on the command zone or in the battlefield, you create a 1/1 vampire. First strike haste. When he attacks, put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. This is one of the commanders that you don't often see on the battlefield until it's too late because he does all the work right from the command zone. Eminence, I feel like he is the poster boy for Eminence.
Yeah, as soon as you sit down with an Edgar Markov player, you kind of know what you're going to be expecting. You're going to be expecting a lot more vampires than a usual Kindred deck would be able to generate in the first 3 turns. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume you're going to be facing down 6 vampires like by turn 3. Those may be pumped. Those may be Anthem affected to attack you, or they might just be value cards to generate stuff, and maybe they ramp out into Edgar. Like, there's a lot of ways it could go, but I think playing against Edgar, you have to know that you're going to be swarmed like really fast, and I definitely think there's a lot of hands that maybe look passable normally, but I would reevaluate if I'm playing against Edgar.
I feel like one of the most important things in a good Edgar deck is having a lot of low-cost vampires. That way, you get 2 bodies on turn 1, and you can just start beating in with them and just making sure you chip in damage. One of the best vampires for this is Indulgent Aristocrat. Black for a 1/1 with lifelink, pay 2, sack a creature, put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. If you start building up a ton of vampires with Edgar's ability, this can be a gigantic boost to your entire team. But on just its face, this is 2 bodies for 1 mana.
I would say this is a bad card that Edgar really rehabilitates into just like, I'm 10 times more scared of this in an Edgar deck than literally any other commander that exists. Even in a different Vampires deck, I'm probably 10 times more scared of this in Edgar because it gives you a body to use right away. Edgar makes more tokens, so the second ability is easier to activate by paying the cost and then easier to pay off because you have twice as many vampires as the other deck. So this card goes from like throwaway chaff to, oh my god, turn 1 and Aristocrat, like, okay, pressure's on. This is the type of thing that I'm so scared of, is facing down 15 power on turn 4. I don't think that's unreasonable.
It's just so nasty. Along with the next one, which if you see this hit the field, run. It's Master of Dark Rites. Black for a 1/1. If you tap it and sack another creature, you add black, black, black to spend only for Vampire, Cleric, or Demon spells. I feel like this is one of the scariest cards in an Edgar deck. It just gives you a body immediately that you can sack next turn, or if you can give it haste somehow, sack immediately to get 3 mana. And this is repeatable. It's so powerful. With every Vampire that you have coming in, it will fuel another activation of this, and that will just power out your game plan immediately. I have dropped five cost vampires on turn 2 with this, and it is incredibly easy.
And all that requires is casting Master of Dark Rites on turn 1 and then having a 5-drop. That's the whole formula. It gives you the creature to sacrifice. Wow, this card I think is like the scariest turn 1 play from Edgar. I think it's scarier than Soul Ring for sure, because vampires, a lot of the little tiny ones are like single red or single black, and you can't really ramp into those with Soul Ring as much. But Master of Dark Rites, I'm expecting like a 3-drop and a 2-drop or something, and it just gets really out of control. Master of Dark Rites is absurd. So is Skull Clamp, by the way. It's a 1-mana equipment that says the equipped creature gets +1/-1. When the equipped creature dies, you draw 2 cards, and it equips for just 1. Everybody knew this card was great, but it definitely gets a boost when you make 1/1s for free. There's no cost associated. So Skull Clamp, even better in this deck. And I think it just adds to the number of 1-mana plays that are going to happen on the first 1 to 3 turns where I am now terrified of this Edgar deck. Because it's, any one of these cards and, the 7 other 1-drops they play are terrifying. They're just scary. I know Edgar's going to have this critical mass of 1s and 2s that makes the pressure huge on, before I might even have access to a board wipe.
It's pretty interesting because if you have a lot of Anthem effects like vampire decks often do, Skull Clamp won't immediately kill the tokens once you just put it on if it is already being buffed. However, that doesn't matter because then you could swing it into people and they don't want to block your token because then you're getting more cards out of it. I feel like it's a win-win either way, no matter how big or how small your vampires are.
Plus, in the late game, you're more likely to have access to sack outlets like Viscera Seer, which you're playing anyway, and Master of Dark Rites, which you're playing anyway. And now, even if your vampires are 3/3s, oh, boo-hoo, I attack with Edgar, now I can't kill it to Skull Clamp. Just sack it if you really need the 2 cards. It's still well within your grasp. We also have a Wrath of Olivia, Olivia's Wrath, 4 and a black sorcery. Each non-vampire creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of vampires you control. Just a one-sided board wipe that keeps the pressure on. This is the thing that separates, I think, the really aggressive decks from the non-aggressive decks, is if they have access to solid one-sided board wipes, it means that they can remove all of your stuff and keep the pressure on without skipping a beat, without missing anything. And this is the type of thing that can just bury you if those first 4 turns really go bad for you.
Yeah, I think, as BZ mentioned, that is a very important part because Edgar decks can go on the more casual side if you have a lot of 3, 4, and 5 mana vampires, if you're just kind of playing the first couple turns lightly. But if you have this on, you can get -6/-6 after 3 turns. It makes it very fast. If you're just casting like vampire, it's just like a couple 1-drops and a 2-drop after, turn 3. That really ramps up the power of this. And making the one-sided board wipes is really just what makes your deck that much more powerful. It's really lucky to be able to get something like this in a Kindred type deck that you don't have to pay 7 for, like Kindred Dominance.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to set up a giant board on the first 4 turns, then play this, wipe everything, beat down as you see fit, take out the highest person or chunk their life total down, and then turn 6 you're ready for Edgar, and you play him because everybody just spent their last turn rebuilding, and you go, all right, attack for like twice as much as what I did last turn. It's just super solid play patterns. Edgar has the early game locked down more than like anybody else. I hate this next one so much. I lose to it every time. It's Cordial
Yeah.
Vampire, black for a 1/1. When it or another creature controlled by anyone dies, you get a counter on all your vampires. So as you sacrifice, as you chump block, as they crack their Sakura Tri-Builder, your vampires get permanently larger. This is just an unbeatable finisher. If you don't kill it, you're gonna lose.
This is very surprisingly annoying because I feel like it doesn't die as much as it really should. I
All
feel
the
like,
time, yeah.
I feel like you talk about it, you're like, guys, we have to kill it, and then well, it's just, how often are things really gonna die? It's happening way faster than you think, whether you do have the Master of Dark Rites type effects where you can sacrifice things, whether we're just running things into you and you have to make the decision of taking a few damage through a couple buff tokens or just chumping with them or just killing them outright and then getting counters on everything else. This is really a pain in the butt. I think it's so great.
Really, really solid, especially since it's a 2-mana investment. You barely spend anything, plus Edgar spots you a token, so even if they kill it, they're probably mana negative on the trade, and you still profit like a piece of cardboard. You still get a token that you can do stuff with. The other route you could go, as opposed to Olivia's Wrathing on turn 5, is you could just develop your board even more with a Champion of Dusk, one of the best vampires. 5 mana, 4/4, ETB, draw X, lose X, where X is your vampire count. So as you spent the first 4 turns playing even just one vampire every turn, this could be like a draw 10 or something, just obscene, and you take over the game from there. If you have I'm not really advocating for you to play Reliquary Tower in a 3-color deck, but if you've got a Thought Vessel or something like that, it's even more value.
I feel like we often talk about Kindred decks and we say stuff like, hey, maybe you don't always need Vanquisher's Banner because you'd want something that's a little bit more synergistic towards your deck. And this is kind of one of those examples. You want vampires in your vampire deck, especially if you have a lot of things that buff when vampires enter, or, buff because you have that many vampires like this. And so having your card draw onto a vampire of itself and a creature type that really helps the deck run a lot more smoothly, really helps your game plan go a long way.
Yeah, I think it's not even a comparison for me, because even in a scenario where you top deck this after a board wipe and you have no other things in play, Vanquisher's Banner does nothing. You choose Vampire and cross your fingers, and this draws you 2 cards right away. It makes a 1/1 and then draws 2. So I don't think anyone was playing this over Vanquisher's Banner, but definitely an example of why you want like 60 vampires in your deck for Edgar. Lastly, Malakir Blood Witch. This is just like the Gray Merchant of vampires. It really is. 3 black, 4/4, flying protection from white, which comes up honestly more than you would think, which I would think never. It comes up quite a bit with blocking flyers and stuff. And when it enters, each opponent loses X, where X is your vampire count, and you gain the total life loss this way. So if you have 5 vampires, you cast this, now you have 7 because of Edgar's shenanigans. They each lose 7, and you gain 21.
The fact that the cast vampire comes in first and then this comes in, just adding to your account, is so nice. It actually does matter in the end, especially if, you got your board wiped, if someone's going to beat you down with a ton and you're like hanging on with just a shred of life. Every little bit makes a difference, and 1 vampire equals 3 life that you are gaining. It's just a very big life swing overall, and if you have something like a veto out or something, you could just take someone out of the game with this.
And you're in black, which might be, black decks are always adjacent to playing Reanimator effects. Like, maybe you play them in your Edgar deck, maybe you don't, but if you have access to that stuff, and you were playing it anyway, it just makes this card even stronger. There are, I think, a couple vampires that reanimate vampires, so that makes it even more likely that you're going to get more activations out of this, more triggers. And this is one of the cards that just breaks your back. Edgar can kill the table, I think, with cards like this by turn 6. I don't think that's unreasonable, and some people are still getting their feet under them at that point. So I am highly favored to look for board wipes, ways to take out little dinky creatures in my opening hand when I'm playing against Edgar, because otherwise you might be in some serious trouble. If you miss a beat and you can't kill their cordial vampire, you might just be dead.
Yeah, or just a lot of ways to defend yourself in the first few turns and set up faster than them. I'm usually looking for faster hands when I go up against an Edgar deck, and usually what I'm worried for when people play against mine is just like very low cost board wipes. A Toxic Deluge can set me back turns.
That could be the difference between you win on turn 6 and now you have to play a normal game of Magic like the rest of us, and play until turn 9 or whatever. All right, next up, I will stress that Commander is not only about winning, but I think this is one of the only commanders that when I see it in a casual game, I legitimately stop thinking that I'm able to win the game, and it turns into, let's just see what happens. Maybe I get lucky or they get unlucky. It's Atali, Primal Conqueror. I'm scared even reading it. 5 red for a 7/7 trample. When it enters, each player exiles cards from the top until they hit a spell. You cast all of those spells for free, and then if you really want to, you can pay 1,000 mana to turn it into like a Blightsteel Colossus, but really, we're just scared of the first thing. This card just kind of does everything for you. It takes care of all of your top end. It is your win condition. It is your card advantage, and I think the thing about Atali that makes it so unbeatable for me is you just need to play ramp. And I can't stop that. There's no way to stop that. If you don't counter Atali, you got turn 4 Atali like almost every time. And that's maybe the middle of the road. You can get turn 3 or whatever if they're playing rituals. You can get turn 5. It doesn't matter a ton. I think it's very, very backbreaking. Every time it resolves, it's going to resolve multiple times. They're going to flicker it. They're going to do whatever. And it's really tough to beat. I think this, for me, is the commander I'm most scared of when we just face up reveal who we're playing.
Honestly, me too. It's the fact that it's like, okay, I can't stop you from playing things like Goblin and Archomancer because that is pretty standard to make your red and green spells cost 1 less in any red and green deck. That makes sense. But when you have Atali on turn 4 or something, and that's going a little bit slower than you'd really think, it's just super scary. 1 Atali trigger can be backbreaking. Imagine like 4 in a single turn. That is actually really possible with this deck.
Yeah, and it's tough to say, oh, you got to kill the Goblin and Archomancer. Every card in their deck is Goblin and Archomancer, whether it's Cultivate, Nature's Lore, even Wild Growth. Those are some of the scariest ones. Exploration, Soul Ring, like this is what their first 3 turns is going to be. Some smattering of like those of 15 to 20 cards. The deck is ready to ramp. It doesn't matter how they do it. You can't realistically take out all of it, especially since half of it is just going to be like Nature's Lore. What are you supposed to do against that? So Atali is coming down, and you better have a plan for it. You better mulligan aggressively, find that good hand. There's also like Rhythm of the Wild, 1 green red enchantment. Creature spells you cast can't be countered, and now they have Riot, so you can either give them a counter or more likely haste for Atali, beat down a little bit. It is 7/7, which means 3 strikes and you're out. This just makes it so that it's a little bit harder to answer Atali. I said one of the best ways to answer it was to counter it, but what if you couldn't?
Yeah, I feel like seeing this and like Vexing Shusher in Atali decks are some of the most standard cards. And the fact that you can just die from commander damage, don't even worry about the fact that you're just getting a bunch of stuff for free. You also have to worry about this 9/9 coming at you if you don't have anything. That's super scary. There's also things like Molten Duplication. Once Atali hits the field, they're going to want to start making copies of it, and it doesn't matter if those copies have to be sacrificed because those triggers are so backbreaking, and this is only 2 mana to make a copy of it. That is incredibly fast, and you're getting so many cards for free out of it.
I mean, we ask ourselves, what is an Atali trigger worth? How much mana would I spend for just that if it was a sorcery? We don't even have a card that does that. I don't even think we're close, because getting a guaranteed 4-for-1 that you don't need to pay mana for, it's just whatever it happens to be, is kind of ridiculous. And so it's worth 7 mana. If Atali was just a 7 mana sorcery, that would be worth it. And so, of course, it's worth it at 2. The only hoop you have to jump through is this is a bad card unless you control Atali. But that's the deck's whole game plan. And what makes it harder for you as an opponent, you don't want to kill it because all the value is from the ETB and other spells they cast. So if you kill it, they're just going to recast it because they've got all those lands and they got the Anarchomancers.
There's so much setup in here too, like Panharmonicon. You're going to be getting double those triggers too. I feel like with this deck, it's just like, okay, well, can we stop Atali from coming in? Can we stop them from having mana? No, well, I guess we're just going to flip until we lose, because it is just so tough to beat all of those free spells, whether it's removal, whether it's something from their deck where they can actually deal damage to you, or they just can keep making copies upon copies, or it's just a win con from your own deck. I feel like this is just such a tough commander to beat.
Look, honestly, I think some of these cards are overkill, because how many Atali triggers do I need before I'm dead? It's like 3. If they can get 3 Atali triggers before I can really set up to have my first bang-in turn, I'm dead. I really will just concede, not out of like salt or anything, because it's just I look at the board and I go, guys, we're dead. I think something that you have to do against Atali is honestly talk to the other people and team up against them, because you're going to need to. And once you wait until Atali hits, it might be too late. You might be able to get some value out of those first 5 turns, kill their things or attack them for chip damage, because it's going to be relevant later. They play Panharmonicon first, then they play Atali, and then ideally they're going to play Conjurer's Closet, which lets them flicker Atali at the end step to get yet another trigger. Again, maybe overkill, but look, it's still efficient, right? Like it's still, we said, what's an Atali trigger worth? I don't know, 8 mana. So it's probably worth 5.
And if you try and kill it, doesn't matter, because it goes back to your hand if you have Team or Sabertooth out. 4 mana to put it out, 2 mana to bring Atali or any other creature, but it's going to be Atali, back to your hand to give this thing indestructible. That doesn't matter. That is a cheap bounce, and then you're going to just play Atali again and get more triggers and keep it safe and make sure it doesn't just keep costing more and more from your command zone. I feel like this deck is so resilient because it's just ramp, Atali, hurt.
You don't need any other ingredients. Atali will do it for you. Even if you don't have any win cons in your whole deck, Atali will eventually hit cards that, when combined with other random cards, will close out the game, whether that's because they're big creatures or because you hit some kind of banger. Like even hitting somebody else's Grey Merchant, that's fine. Chip damage, let's go. I'll bolster my life total. It's nice no matter what you hit. I think Atali does not need to play that many win cons in the deck, but Keeper of Secrets is a pretty good one. It's 5 and a red for a 6/4 with first strike and haste, and whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, he deals damage to the spell's mana value to target opponent. So we want to play this before Atali. It does kind of curve into it. We're going to assume we're ramping, so maybe we play this on like turn 4 and then Atali on 5, and we hit 4 spells. They all trigger Keeper, and we get to zap somebody, maybe take them out of the game. More realistically, chip everybody down equally so you can keep leeching off their library with future triggers.
It's just such a rough scenario to be in. I feel like one of the best ways to combat this commander is to talk to your opponents, as BZ mentioned earlier. You kind of have to team up to make sure that they're not getting too many triggers about this, and just kind of play keep away. I mean, that's not the nicest way to play, but this is also not the nicest commander to play against.
Yeah, if we're assuming everybody's playing to win, and that's a totally mutually agreed upon goal of the pod, I think you basically are conceding the game if you just pretend like everybody's showing up with a commander that has an equal chance of winning with Atali and 3 other random commanders, because that thing will annihilate you, and that's totally fine. I'm not saying I'll never play against Atali, but I'm going to have a game plan. I'm not going to just roll over. And some of the ways to combat Atali comes from how you act before Atali resolves.
Yeah, keep those counter spells if you can, and make sure to get rid of the things that say they can't be countered or can't be targeted or anything like that.
Yeah, if I have counterspell, I am saving it until the end of time. I will time lock myself just to hold up a counterspell against Atali because it's that bad. All right, next up is your maybe least favorite commander ever, so I'll let you read this one.
It's Joda the Unifier, Wooburg for a 5/5. Legendary creatures you control get +X, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. Whenever you cast a legendary spell from your hand, you exile cards from the top until you hit a legendary non-land card with less mana value. You can cast it for free and then put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Free cascading legendaries. There are so many good legendaries out that you can play for value that don't need decks built around them, and Joda goes, what if you just played all of them? What if you played everything from the 1 drops to the 10 drops and everything in between, and we just got a bunch of free stuff in the middle? One of the easiest ones to play turn 1 was Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, red for a 2/1. When it deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure, exile the top card of that player's library, and then you can play it or dash it for 1 in a red. That is just one of the easiest ways to get Joda out immediately, or at least as quickly as possible, because you're going to be gaining mana from it and taking cards from your opponents.
I honestly think Joda is like a combination of Edgar Markov and Atali in the sense that you are guaranteed to get things for free, sort of off the top. And it is kind of like the win con built into the deck. Like, oh, I want to play a bunch of legends, but what do I do once I have them? Nothing. That's all you have to do. You just need to get a bunch of legends in play, because with Joda, you have 4 legends. That's 16 power. That's enough to KO people on top of whatever the original power of the creatures is. And if you have any other ways to synergize or get an extra combat with those 16 powers, or just untap like most people do, play another legend, attack for a bajillion, Joda will mess you up. You absolutely have to be mindful of the turn Joda is going to hit the field, and that should impact how you play your first 5 turns. You don't know when it's going to be. Maybe they ramp into it on turn 4, but turn 4, 5, or 6 is when you need to have the alarm bells going off. Save your Soul Shatter. Get some kind of way to take Joda off, because that will buy you so much extra time, versus you might actually just die if you don't do that.
I think it's also wild, too, because you see Joda, and I guess it's not immediately obvious, but he counts himself towards the buff, so he's automatically a 6/6.
Kind of just bad templating. I don't know why it's worded that way.
So he's also 4 strikes and you're out with commander damage, which he didn't need the buff plus stats plus cascade type effect, plus just, I think that is so much that you just have to be worried about overall, because it's like, oh, well, I guess they could kill me with their overrun effect. I guess they could also kill me with their free spells. I guess they could just kill me with Joda himself if I don't keep up enough blockers. This is interesting. I have to be worried from all angles at this point.
Yeah, like we were saying, the first thing, like with Edgar, you want to do is just get any legend down that is cheap, because they will eventually be 7/7s, and that's totally worth your mana. Like K9 Mark 1, he's a blue 1/1, and if he's untapped, your legendary creatures have Ward 1, which is a nice extra layer of protection that you don't have to pay for, and you can actually make a legendary creature unblockable by paying 1 in a blue and tapping him as well. So just another thing to spend your mana efficiently, because you can go a couple different routes. You can play the Joda value of like, well, if I untap with him, I'm going to cast 3 legends and go off that way. I think maybe the scarier way as an opponent of Joda is for you to just play a 1-drop legend, a 2-drop legend, a 3-drop legend, a 4-drop legend, and then Joda, and literally attack for like 25 at that point. Now, Joda still has his cascade stuff if it comes to that, but you're more worried about the immediate, oh my god, it's Coat of Arms.
There's so many ways to build this, and all of them are scary. And then you're just going to be getting a ton of really good effects off the legendaries to begin with. Reiki, the History of Kamigawa, Tuna Green 1/2. Whenever you cast a legendary spell, you draw a card. This is the synergy we're talking about, because you're going to be cascading into a smaller legendary if Joda is out. You're going to be getting cards off of it as the game progresses, and it's just going to make your overrun bigger and bigger. This is just such a nasty deck overall.
Yeah, I think for every moment before and up to when they play Joda that you can disrupt one of their early legends, I think it really does take a chunk out of their power of beating the crap out of you very, very early. So even if you can kill their Reki, on turn 3 with something, maybe you fire off the swords on it, that really does take a giant chunk out of how much damage they're going to have. Because once they have Joda, and let's just say they have 5 legends at that point, we take out Reki, that's not only 5 less power, 6 less power that Reki would have, but 1 less power that each other thing has. So we just took 10 power sort of preemptively off the board, and I think that stuff is like super huge. Definitely worth considering when you play against Joda. We got Kethis, the hidden hand as well. Not the biggest combo. It's white, black, green for a 3/4. Legends cost 1 less, so it doesn't ramp you with Joda unless you have tax. But you can exile 2 legendary cards from your graveyard, including lands or whatever, and then just cast other legends from your graveyard, which starts to be nonsensical in the late game.
I feel like there's so many value legends too that are like, I would love to build this as my commander, or this one, but they're too similar. And Joda's like, hey, why don't you just throw all of them in here because they'll all be great.
Come on board. We also have Relic of Legends, a 3-mana artifact, taps for a mana of any color, and you can tap an untapped legend you control to add a mana of any color. So just like absolute free value sauce. If you were not attacking with legends, they ramps you into more legends, which ramp you into more legends. You can do this even the turn a legend comes into play because it's not ability that requires summoning sickness or not. This is in like 62% of Joda decks, and I was kind of surprised that the colorless version of this, Honor Worn Shaku, which is almost the same card but obviously worse because of the colorless thing, is only in 4%. I haven't played enough Joda personally to know, because it is a pip intensive deck. If you've got a bunch of Ragavans and Canines and Joda, maybe you don't care about the colorless, but it seemed pretty good. It seemed better than 4%. I don't know. Anyway, this is just another ramp spell that means if this card's in play, they have a lot more mana than it looks like, even on board.
I feel like the pips are really intensive, especially since when we're suggesting things and we don't even play Joda, these are like pip, 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 and then Joda himself is 5 pips, that it's just really tough to use that, I guess, colorless mana in Honor Worn Shaku effectively, or as effectively as you'd like. But with effective decks, there's always seems to be a one-sided board wipe, like Urza's Ruinous Blast. It's a legendary sorcery, but you're always going to have legendaries, so that part doesn't really matter. You exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary, which is basically everyone's stuff but yours.
Yeah, all of your stuff is going to be legendary for the most part, and this is the same thing as Livia's Wrath. It's the same play pattern. You build up this giant board, and then the turn that you would put pressure on and make them chump block, you just remove everything they have. They have to start over. Your board is completely intact. Probably with Joda more than Edgar, you're killing someone at this point. The other two players now have a choice of like rebuild or fire off a board wipe on their own. But honestly, if you're to the point where you have this big board, they should have already played one, which means they don't really have one, and you might just win. Urza's Ruinous Blast shuts the door on a game, potentially a couple turns early because it removes all counterplay in the combat step.
Yeah, they usually might have their commander left, but other than that, they are not left with much, and that is very good for you. There's also Captain Sisay, 2 white green for a 2/2. If you tap her, you search your library for a legendary card, reveal that, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Just a free legendary tutor, which is going to be at least like 40% of your deck to begin with.
Yeah, not the best for pressuring people early, but it is the best as soon as you get into any sort of like parity where everybody's about equal and you're all building up boards. This card's ridiculous. It also, notably, can search for legendary sorceries. So this is a copy of Urza's Ruinous Blast if you are behind at all, which I find super scary. And I'm going to kill Sisay every time she hits the field in a Joda deck.
I mean, tutoring for half of your deck, bare minimum, that is so scary.
Just
in
on
general.
a tap, yeah.
I mean, tutors in general are scary, but being able to find so much good stuff in that deck, it is so easy.
Yeah, like
kill that.
Sisay can still find lands, sorceries, and creatures. That's basically everything. It's very, very scary. All right, next up, we got a froggy commander. This is the Gitrog monster. Terrified of this man. 3 green black for a 6/6 death touch. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice him unless you sacrifice a land. You can play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. I think in hindsight, this might have been like a slight design mistake because Gitrog Monster is a very strong magic card, whether you play with it fairly or not. But there is an elephant in the room that we have to address, and that is Dakmor Salvage. This is a land and enters tapped. It makes black mana, but it has Dredge 2. Dredge means instead of drawing a card, you can replace that action with milling 2 cards, because it's Dredge 2 in this case, and returning whatever card has Dredge, like Dakmor Salvage, back to your hand. When you do that, you are milling cards. Gitrog Monster being in play says, oh, were any of those lands? If so, draw a card. Now, this is a high power combo piece with like discard outlets, Lotus Petal, and like Kozilek Butcher of Truth to shuffle your entire deck to make infinite mana. That I don't think is the norm. That combo is in like 30% of Gitrog Monster decks, which I think are mostly CDH. We're talking about maybe the more casual side. This card is still unbelievably scary. With a discard outlet, it's draw your whole deck. Even without that, discarding to hand size will take forever with Gitrog. Discarding a Dakmor Salvage to hand size means you do all the things. You draw the cards off of Gitrog, and then you still have more than 7 cards, so you're still in your cleanup, which just means you're basically drawing what feels like your whole deck. So against Gitrog, you have to know that there's going to be some shenanigans. They're going to ramp, and it's going to be tough to keep Gitrog off the field unless you can kill it. Like the first time without them untapping, that is a huge tempo swing for you.
I feel like Dakmor Salvage is the first card that I ever learned about in relation to the Gitrog monster. It's like its poster card. That is what it is. And I feel like the combo is just feared overall. I feel like people know about that. It's like, oh, do you want me to resolve this or not? Like, it's going to take a while because, it's non-deterministic.
Because it's nonsense. Yeah. I think the Dakmor Salvage is in like 80% of Gitrog. You're going to see it. The combo, more like 30, and I think that's still like CDH. So I wouldn't worry too much about, oh my god, I saw Dakmor Salvage, so I'm dead. But you are going to be dead if you don't do something right away. Like, it's basically draw their whole deck.
The next card is Crop Rotation, green for an instant. As additional cost to cast it, you sack a land, but that's no problem for you. Search your library for a land card, any land. Put that card on the battlefield, then shuffle. Getting cards because you're sacking a land and going to find your best land is such good value in this because you also draw a card off of it. This is all for a single green mana anytime you want.
Yeah, it's proportional to how good the best land in your deck is, but we already know that the vast majority of people are playing Dakmor Salvage in their deck, so if they have a way to sacrifice it, which they certainly will at some point, it can get really, really scary. Crop Rotation, it's one of the best tutors in the format for lands, so just keep an eye out. Life in the Loam is a card you will see all over the place because it's one of the green sorcery with Dredge 3. That alone might be good, but it also returns 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand. So as you're milling, you go get 3 lands, and that what it'll often do with Gitrog in play is make your hand more than 7 cards. So you go, all right, discard the lands that I just put in my hand to draw real cards, and then discard continuously until you end up with 7 cards, and it just sculpts your hand. It's so hard. And the thing about land decks is they require these specific answers, like, oh, I need a Generous Gift to kill their best land because it's annoying, or Nykthos, whatever. Well, now with stuff like this, they're just going to keep getting it back. And you don't have extra Generous Gifts lying around for the most part. But it's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to are you going to use Demolition Field on their Nykthos to draw them a card when they have Life in the Loam in the graveyard? You just can't do that. So you need to find another way to combat them. Or if you've got like Bajuka Bog sitting in your deck somewhere, heavily prioritize finding that in some way if you have tutors to deal with Gitrog. There's also Aftermath Analyst, great at filling the graveyard. It's a 1 in a green, 1/3 that mills 3, but you can pay 3 in a green, and this is the killer, to return all of your lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped if you sacrifice the Analyst. This means that the Gitrog player is now incentivized to have a stocked graveyard, but they can start doing some other nasty things with lands, like sacrificing them without having to care about that, as long as they can make the mana for this, which turns into this ritual thing. And that is exemplified by Squandered Resources, green and a black for an enchantment. Sacrifice a land, add 1 mana of that type the land can produce to your mana pool. Now they can just sacrifice all their lands, play a Splinter Reclamation, play an Analyst, get them all back, and now it doesn't matter that they enter tapped because they can sack them for mana, and every single instance of 1 sacrifice on a land is draw card for the Gitrog monster. So you are screwed if this combo comes together. Gitrog needs to get off the field.
This deck is just very hard to disrupt because there's so little land removal to begin with, and when we do, it's usually single target removal on things like Wasteland or Demo Field or stuff like that. So when they're able to just recur so many types of lands, and so quickly too with Squandered Resources and then anything that brings them back very quickly, and then also get card advantage out of that, I feel like I'm dead like the second that hits the field and I don't have removal for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a crazy play pattern. You play Squander Resources on 2, Aftermath Analyst on turn 3, Gitrog Monster, let's say on turn 5. Already, I can sack my whole board. I'll sack all my lands, draw like 6 cards, get them all back, and then do it again if I want to. Or, I have a bunch of cards in my hand to go from there. So really, really tough. I think instead of trying to focus on the removal, like if I had a Generous Gift, I would just hit the Gitrog. Like I think you just have to get Gitrog off the field, but crucially before they ramp up, because there are like a lands deck. So if they have 10 to 15 lands into play, what does killing Gitrog do? It doesn't do that much for you anymore. So you have to like really catch them when they're developing, or else you're in big trouble, which is probably why it's one of the most feared commanders. Another one that's my favorite that probably requires a sack outlet is Underrealm Lich, 3 green black for a 4/3. If you would draw, instead look at the top 3, take 1 to your hand and the rest into the graveyard. That's pretty good. And you can pay 4 life to give it indestructible and tap it. So with Gitrog Monster and Underrealm Lich and nothing else, you look at the top 3 cards, you take 1 card. If any of the other 2 are lands, you draw a card, which is replaced by looking at the top 3, taking 1. So that's going to rip through your entire library, almost whether you want to or not. So make sure you have a sack outlet or something to actually take advantage of this or win the game.
I feel like Underrealm Lich is underplayed. I think this card is very good, and I don't see it as often as I really think I should.
I love this card. It's one of my favorites.
Oh, another one of your favorites, though, is Field of the Dead. Have you guys heard of this one? It's a land. It enters tapped. It makes colorless. If you have 7 or more lands out, it's going to make a zombie, a 2/2 zombie or
That
something.
seems good.
Yeah, it seems pretty good if you have so many lands coming in immediately, especially when you're sacking things like to squandered resources, and then you bring them all back, and then you get a ton of zombies, and then you do it again. I think that this can go real fast.
This is more a meme. I just love talking about Field of the Dead. You know, it's like play a bunch of lands, question mark profit. This is one of many options you can plug into for the question mark. As long as you have triggers off lands, you can win the game pretty easily. If that means, you know, sacking all my lands and recurring them makes 25 zombies, or I have like Retreat to Hagra and Landfall drains my opponents for 1. Any sort of thing you can plug in there, that's a great way to close out with Get Wrong. Next, we're moving on to one of the scariest commanders I think that everybody could agree on, but only one specific type of the deck of that commander. It's Atraxa, and yes, it is that Atraxa deck. It's green, white, blue, black for a 4/4 with Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, proliferate. What are we proliferating, you might ask? In this instance, we are only talking about poison counters that go on players. If you have 10 poison counters, you lose the game in Atraxa in this context. And for the rest of this video, we're not going to mention this again. We're only talking about that. We'll just turbo you to 10 as fast as possible, almost like a burn deck.
I feel like with poison, you have to play fast. As a poison player myself,
I've died to that so many times.
Because of the fact that if you say, hey, this is an Atraxa deck, it is that Atraxa deck, you're going to have a target on your head immediately. There are very few players who are playing things like Solemnity and stuff that take counters off, or play things that can't give them counters. And because of that, every single time you proliferate a poison counter or they get one, that is 10% of their life that you are just chunking off that they can never get back. That's what makes it so scary.
And if it was that easy to burn players out, then all you would do is hyper aggro. Like, I don't need to play as the Atraxa player. I don't need to play a 6-drop. Who cares? Like, I'm playing Blighted Agent. I'm sure we'll get into that. Like, Bilious Skulldweller is our example here. Black for a 1/1 Death Touch. Toxic 1. If they get hit, they take 1 poison. And the deck is full of a lot of these like little dinky guys that come down on turn 1s and 2 and ask the question, do you have a blocker right now? If you do not have a blocker, you are on the board. And now all of my proliferation is live. Whereas if you don't take that initial ding from this Bilious Skulldweller or one of his dumb friends, then you are ineligible to be proliferated. So when you are playing against Atraxa and it is that Atraxa deck, you need a blocker, because Atraxa is more likely to just play threats and develop and hit the players with no blockers versus play one thing and then kill your guy to chip through. That's not a winning strategy. They're going to play more guys first. So if you get a blocker down turns 1, 2, 3, you're kind of in good shape to at least delay the inevitable, because eventually they're going to play something like Infectious Bite, which just says 1 in a green, target creature bites something, and then each opponent gets a poison.
Honestly, with the kind of just all will be 1 sets and all of that, I think it's just actually all will be 1. That just really sped up poison decks to begin with, because prior to that, all we had were Ichor Rats to give each player, including yourself, a poison counter. But with the event of things like Phyresis Outbreak and Infectious Bite, Phyresis Outbreak being Tuna Black Sorcery, each opponent gets a poison counter, then each creature your opponents control gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each poison counter its controller has. This makes it a lot easier to get those initial poison counters out. All you really need is 1 to start the game, and that is the most crucial one that you want to avoid getting. But with cards like this that just give you 1 immediately, really helps you turbo out those proliferation threats a lot faster than you would have been able to prior, because you're not relying so hard on combat damage.
Also, common theme, a deck that wants to really add to the board with scary creatures the first 3 turns has a one-sided board wipe that will absolutely annihilate you if you spend the whole game, not paying attention to it. If you don't have a blocker and you go, sure, I'll take a poison, well, how bad could it be? Then you get proliferated twice, and then you finally build up a board, and you're like, well, now I have blockers, and they just kill them all because you got poison counters earlier, so you're just like screwed out of it. It's really tough to come back from a Phyresis Outbreak. I think what really helped this deck is the Commander Precon, Ixal.
Oh, that
where,
was so good.
They scaled Infect to multiplayer in a lot of these things, and it's very, very tough to beat sometimes, like with Drought and Ichor from the main set. 1 in a black sorcery, target creature gets -4 until end of turn, proliferate. 1 in a black sorcery, Grasp of Darkness, is pretty bad, but when you tack on they're 10% dead and they can't heal, then we just start playing anything like that that's cheap, that can interact with the board a little bit, take out a utility creature, take out a blocker, maybe if we've already developed, and just make it so that you're getting beat down, and every spell they play kills you by 10%. So it's almost like After the first 3 turns, when Atraxa player plays 10 spells, you lose.
I feel like when you have the big target on your head of poison, you need to be able to burn people out very quickly because they're coming for you, whether that's through commander damage or just normal damage. You only have so much life that you can work with, and only so much time to get those initial counters on and proliferate. So you need a lot of cheap ways to do that. And while this card isn't that impressive on its face, being able to count for 10% of the life total really matters. Stapling proliferate onto anything is the most important part of this deck, with things like Karn's Bastion, a land that will tap for colors, or in a pinch you can tap it and 4 mana to proliferate. This can be the difference between losing the game through combat damage or winning because all of your opponents are dead through poison.
Yeah, this deck's win con is not really on board. Once you get the critical first poison, either through it's a sorcery that does it just by itself, it just says they get a poison, or through chipping through with Abilia's Skull Dweller or one of his friends, even if your board gets completely obliterated, you can still win the game without playing any more creatures. You can just fire off a few more of these proliferates, poison, draw card, augmenters, something. I almost named a card. I just lose to them so fast. Fire off these proliferates, and then this card can, even though it's a little awkward because it makes colorless mana, you can go pass. They're at 8 poison, threatening a win by going end step proliferate, untap proliferate. And it's just the fact that you have access to that makes the deck so much more resilient and scary to play against. If you're playing Atraxa Poison, I'm going to target you very aggressively until you are dead or it appears like you couldn't possibly win.
I feel like also being able to put 1 or 2 proliferates with 1 or 2 spells is very, very powerful because that's like a 1 mana here, 2 mana here. Then you're able to build that up, and that's 20% dead. But there are big spells that you can just finish people with.
Closers.
So you can just come out of nowhere and win the game, one of them being Broker's Confluence. 2 white, green, blue for an instant. You could choose 3. You could choose the same mode more than once. You can either proliferate, which is usually your main win con. Target creature phases out in a pinch if you really need it, or counter target activated or triggered ability. I've actually used that last one sometimes because there's so few ways to be able to counter abilities, and then also getting a couple poison proliferates in there really helps close the game out a lot faster than you'd think.
Yeah, I mean, this is 5 mana proliferate 3 times with some extra stuff on it. If you're gonna pass a turn with this mana up with the intention of casting it no matter what happens. Every once in a while, someone will put a triggered ability on the stack that is worse for you than it would be nice to have an extra poison on everybody. So like with an Atali or something, cool. Counter that, then proliferate twice. That's fine. Most of the time, this is like the hammer that closes out the game, and it's one of the reasons I think a lot of the 5 and 6 mana infect creatures are massively overplayed because you just have a lot of cards like this, and Plane-Wide Celebration is another one, and one we'll get to after this, that just say, without attacks or blocks or any sort of shenanigans, you're just dead. You're 30% dead with this one card. Atraxa is your commander. That's probably good for 1 or 2 proliferates as we go through. Atraxa is not essential to the game plan, so it's not the same as Gitrog where, just kill Atraxa before they can develop and you'll be fine. It's like, Atraxa's okay. The rest of the crappy 2 mana instance is what I'm scared of, and there's too many to counter.
Honestly, when I play my Atraxa deck and I'm trying to go as fast as possible, I'm only playing Atraxa to kind of even out my life total, get a block, or if I'm worried about commander damage taking me out or something like that. It's more of a deterrent than anything else.
Plus colors.
Yeah, the proliferate's nice, but if I have a Bloom Tender and someone's trying to swing at me for 12 and that's a big chunk, it's just okay, I guess this could be a good Death Touch blocker. It's not crucial to the win, but one of the cards that is crucial to the win is Radstorm. 3 and a blue for an instant with Storm Proliferate. Two lines of text only, but these are incredibly powerful because I have taken people from 2 to 10 with this card alone.
On turn 6
yeah.
From me. Yeah, this is a card that, there's a critical mass now of these cards that just proliferate you to death. And it's one of the reasons that after you hit 5 infect, you are in the danger zone, and you need to focus all of your energy, unless you are imminently dead to something else on the table, to taking out Atraxa. And if you don't have, I think that sort of mindset, people get bamboozled by the Broker's Confluences, the Plane-Wide Celebrations, and the Radstorms to just go from 5 to 10 very, very quickly and kind of go, well, what happened? It's you just have to recognize that these cards exist. The Atraxa players all have them, and plan accordingly, which is kill the Atraxa player, kill everything they do, hit them to dead, because you are going to get burned out over the very few turns if you don't.
Radstorm is especially nasty because one counterspell doesn't seal the deal with this. It will copy for as many spells as the people are casting, and usually that's a lot, whether they're bobbling, making sure that there's, just a couple plays. They're trying, it's mid-game or something to play a 3-drop and a 2-drop that they had left over. All right, well, a bobble, a 3-drop, a 2-drop, and this is already 4 proliferates, and that's just nothing. If you're playing against Cascade, if you're playing against like an Atali player or something, you can get a lot more of those. Or if you have anything in your hand that you can fuel towards those like really cheap interactions. That's another reason why I mentioned like it is very important to make sure you have cheap interaction and just cheap proliferates in your hand. A lot of them are at instant speed, so being able to do that and then just feed into your own storm can really help you just turn them from like 3 to 10. It's not as tough as you might think.
Yeah, the average case for Red Storm is not 8. Don't think it's, you're just dead. But I think the average is honestly like 2.5 to 3. Maybe 2.5 to 3.5, or we could just say 3. It's very, very likely to have that happen, especially since as you're behind, you are more required to scramble and put something together to find more cards and answer or put pressure on the Atraxa player. So I think if you're playing against Traxa, it is very, very scary if it's poison. It's one of the scariest commanders. Definitely prioritize early blockers like turn 1, 2, and 3 for sure. Maybe 3 is even too late. Prioritize the early blockers. That's step 1. Step 2 is now that you've sort of put them off of their like script a little bit and you've delayed the inevitable until they can manually get a poison on you, which is maybe a couple turns later. Now you have to pressure them constantly and annoy the crap out of them, or else they're going to just pass, play Broker's Confluence, and then untap and play something else and just kill you.
Honestly, another one is to hold up interaction to counter things that look like they shouldn't be countered. There's Prologue to Phyresis, which is just draw a card and each opponent gets a poison counter for 2 mana. But being able to counter that on turn 2 is really detrimental to the poison game plan overall because that first poison is the most important one of all.
If it's turn 2, you're really going to have to weigh the options, the pros and cons between not developing your board and maybe not playing a blocker. But if the Atraxa player doesn't have an attacker and you don't have anything else to do, I would 1,000% hold up a counterspell and get that thing off the stack because the first poison is the most important. So realistically, if you can put down your blockers first couple turns, throw them off their script, and then later hold up counterspells with the opportunity of denying that first poison, 100% do that. That's important.
I feel like there's so much cheap interaction nowadays that if you have something like an offer you can't refuse and you're like, oh, I should save this for later. No, you should not save it for later. This is the most important poison, and if you have the mana and you have a blocker, you should be playing it then despite it not looking that scary and going from 0 to 1, and that's not that much poison.
That's the most poison. That's the biggest percent increase in poison. I would say the most important things to counter, those early game, sorceries and instants that automatically put one on when you don't have any, and then obviously the late game like 5 to 7 mana proliferate. But note that doesn't work on Radstorm, so be careful. Next up, we have Ob Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. This guy is pretty annoying. I've only played against him a couple times, but he makes a pretty big impact. 2 red black for a 4/3 Flampler. Whenever one of our opponents lose exactly 1 life, put a +1/+1 counter on him, and then you exile the top card of your library, and until your next end step, you can play that card. So there's a lot of things that happen. When they lose 1 life, which is what this entire deck's going to be about, you get a bigger Ob Nixilis. You basically draw a card, and also, they kind of lost a life, so you've got pressuring your life total, Ob Nixilis becoming like a commander damage threat, and just these tiny little chips away. And what Ob Nixilis does is just sort of make the game this group slug. Like, you are getting hammered in your life total, but you also got to prepare to deal with Ob Nixilis. But even if you take out Ob Nixilis, all the other cards still ping you every time you do something. So you got to have to get things together for your opening hands. How do you usually like to deal with Ob Nixilis?
Oh, I just try and get him off the board as fast as possible through any means necessary. I could take the damage. I can suffer through a bunch of little 1 pings, but I can't deal with this gigantic 2020 Flampler coming at me. And then also every single time I get pinged, you have 10 cards that you can just deal with until your next turn. It's just so much advantage. It's so much commander damage coming at you. It can be a 1-hit kill provided that you let this get 2 out of hand. One of the biggest cards in this deck is Dark Ritual, the number 1 Ob Nixilis card. Block for an instant, add black, black, black. This is good if you're trying to do rituals to begin with, but being able to get Ob Nixilis out turn 2 is what really sets this apart, because that is just so much more advantage than if you waited till turn 4.
The Ob Nixilis players tend to play most of the rituals. 30-something% of the decks have all the red ones and the ones that are less profitable than Dark Ritual, and then of course 80%. It's the most played. I think it's more played than Soul Ring in this deck. Is because and that's interesting because not every deck that could play rituals is like that. But Ob Nixilis, they are spamming Dark Ritual. You have to be concerned about it at least a little bit. It helps get Ob Nixilis back if he died once or twice. I think what you said is right. I think you really have to take out Ob Nixilis because while it does leave in play all the little annoying pingers, I've seen Ob Nixilis players sputter out a little bit because that's like their main source of card advantage. And if they don't have enough by happenstance because they didn't draw it or they didn't put enough in their deck, you can definitely punish them, but it does require that first sniping of Ob Nixilis. You gotta take them out.
I'm usually keeping like a swords in hand or something. I might mull or at least try and find enough like card draw in my opening hand to deal with Ob Nixilis because this gets so out of hand so quickly. They're going to be playing a bunch of little things like Cataract Parasite, black for a 1/1. Whenever an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, you can have this deal 1 damage to that player. You're going to be getting so many triggers off all of the opponent's draw phases, and it's going to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Bare minimum, if Ob Nixilis is out and this is out, this is going to make him from 4 to 7 with just no other draw effects. If they have something to actually help them get some cards advantage, this will be making Ob Nixilis even bigger. It's just really hard to deal with at that point.
It's a really low investment card that comes down before Ob Nixilis in every case. Even if you play Ob on turn 2 with a ritual, you can play this on turn 1 and just start the chain with drawing cards and getting all this stuff. And even if you can kill Ob Nixilis, if they get 3 cards off of it, that could be tough to come back from because that might help them develop with a mana rock or something, and then Ob Nixilis is even closer the next time. So it's definitely tricky. Cataract Parasite is just annoying. And same with Roiling Vortex. This card is $4. It's so good in this deck that people went to the bulk rare museum and pulled this thing out of it. It's 1 in a red for an enchantment, hits everybody on their upkeep for 1. Whenever a player casts a spell, if they cast it for free, they take 5. That's kind of real. It doesn't come up that often, and you can't really control it, but you got to be mindful of it. And red, your opponents can't gain life this turn, which is super annoying because one of the ways I would think to come out from under this is to, kill Ob Nixilis and then gain life. But when you try to gain 5 life at once, this doesn't really let it happen.
It's so real that your opponents can't gain life. We were just playing against this card, and I was playing like my Sorin life gain deck, and that was so real. But it wasn't even used at me. It was used at the other person who was like 3 pings away from dying, and they tried to, sword their own creature or just get some life with a life linker, and then it's just like, it doesn't matter at a certain point. If they get you low enough, 1 red mana is like a single red mana is such a low investment to make sure it's like, oh no, you actually can't get out of this.
Yeah, shout outs to our friend Nick. He was playing Ob Nixilis and he was showing us the truth. We also have things like Unstable Amulet. Looks like an energy card, randomly perfect for this deck. It's 1 in a red artifact, ETB, you get 2 energy. Whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, which Ob Nixilis gives you access to, it deals 1 damage. Oh, that literally just goes off. It's not a combo, but every spell you cast with Ob Nixilis gives you another damage, which gives you another spell from Ob Nixilis. And you can tap it to pay 2 energy and exile top card of your library, and you can play it until you exile another card with it, which could be a while because we don't really care about energy in this deck. So it gives you like 1 free use, and then it just goes ham sandwich with Ob Nixilis. Definitely a combo. You have to be really careful about.
I feel like Unstable Amulet was one of those cards that slipped under the radar from MH3. It is a pretty good card, especially if you can cast multiple things from exile or if that's the entire theme of your deck. And just, I feel like no one talks about it enough. Just a side note.
There was just so many good cards in MH3 at common and uncommon that I don't think any one set review could handle them both unless it was like 5 hours long. But this is where you see those hidden gems just pop back up. Next up is probably the most annoying Ob Nixilis card. It's very difficult to play Magic and not lose the game when they have Mana Barbs, which is 3 in a red enchantment. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, it deals 1 damage to them. Just the most perfect card that could ever be made for Ob Nixilis, because every single, even if you tap 5 lands at once, that's 5 individual triggers for you to lose 1 and trigger Ob Nixilis 5 times.
It's well worth the 4 mana investment, and it's still well worth the amount of damage that you're going to be taking for playing your own spells, because you're going to be getting that many more pings and that much more cards and counters of Ob Nixilis. So if they can't remove him, then you're going to be swinging in and killing someone with all that commander damage. And even if they can remove him with something like swords, that's still a ton of life you're going to be gaining, and it'll keep you in the game even longer.
Having Mana Barbs and Ob Nixilis, I think, is sort of the dream scenario. It's really hard to come out from under that. If they have Ob Nixilis out and they play Mana Barbs, you're guaranteed. We're in the middle to late game stages. You're at a low life total. You're not above 25 against this deck where they just have all these things that are pinging you for playing the game. They're unavoidable pings. So you're going to be at like 25 life, and now you have 2 big threats in play. Ob Nixilis is going to be like a 20-20 as you tap mana. But you really don't want to lose life for just playing the game, because that's not tenable. You only have so many spells you can cast. So do you kill the Ob Nixilis and leave the Mana Barbs to ping you away? Or do you kill the Mana Barbs and leave the 20-20 Flampler in play? It's an impossible decision.
I feel like there are so many little threats that if you don't wipe them out early with this deck and Ob Nixilis stays out on the field, it's just going to get so impossible to deal with. Especially, that's why I was mentioning earlier, it's like I think the big thing is make sure you kill him or counter him as soon as possible, because if they are like most Ob Nixilis players and they're playing a lot of rituals, that will set them back quite a few turns because they're trying to power him out as soon as possible.
Of course, the Ob Nixilis player knows this, that they're playing the most lightning rod commander ever, so they're going to play things like Bolt Bend, 3 in a red instant, costs 3 less if they have a 4-power creature. That's Ob Nixilis, and it changes the target of a spell or ability with a single target. They're going to be playing a lot of like the Tivalt's trickeries and stuff, because the huge inflection point for them is, can I untap with Ob Nixilis, or can I get 2 to 3 payoffs in play? So if they can do that, they probably win. So they're going to be playing these cards that you might have to pay attention to. I don't know if it's like, it's not like I shouldn't cast a Swords on an Ob Nixilis if they have 1 mana up, but I think being mindful of it definitely helps you.
Yeah, I think so too. And just all will be 1 3 red for an enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, it deals that much damage to target opponent, creature in opponent's control, or planeswalker in opponent controls. This is just free damage basically anywhere you want. And because of the fact that you're going to be getting so many counters on Ob Nixilis, and people are going to be dealing damage just because of your game plan and your group slug type of play pattern, this can just take people out really fast.
It will take people out extremely fast because it goes infinite with our boy Ob Nixilis. As you put 1 counter on Ob Nixilis, you deal 1 damage to an opponent, which puts 1 counter on Ob Nixilis. So this is just 1-2. Literally, you are all dead right now, and there's almost no downside for it. So in addition to all the really annoying pinging Ob Nixilis is doing, and the card advantage that he's getting, and the power he's throwing around, this is just, if it resolves and anything happens, you die. So you also have to be mindful of like the Splinter Twin that's lurking in this deck.
Surprise! It's Moxfield time. Moxfield is the best place online where you can build decks or look at other people's. If you want to get some inspiration, you can look at our profile and you can see every deck that we've ever played, whether it's current or we've retired it. Or you could build your own. Go online and sign up for Moxfield right now. The next commander is one that I don't see as much as I think, and maybe it's because it's a little too spicy. It's Skullbriar, the Walking Grave, green-black for a 1/1 with haste. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a 1/1 counter on it. But the most important part is counters remain on it as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library. So if you kill it and you bring it back to the command zone, you could just play it again and it will still be gigantic if it's been hitting people or you've been gaining counters on it the entire time.
I love this card. I had a Skullbriar deck for years, and I did take it apart because I think I didn't enjoy some of the play patterns that this card caused, but those play patterns are definitely something to be on the lookout for if you're playing against it, because Skullbriar will murder you. It is very simple. I don't even think the Atraxa game plan works out as well here, because it doesn't matter if you put down a blocker early, it's going to chip in, as one of you's not going to have something. So it's just going to chip in that player, accumulate counters. The deck also just manually puts them on with a bunch of cards that we'll get to, and then he turns into like a 12/12 with haste. So even if you kill him, they replay him for 4, or they reanimate him from their graveyard as the counters don't leave, even if he's in the graveyard. And it gets really tough because commander damage starts racking up. So this is like the commander damage entry of, oh my god, I should be very afraid of this. Surprisingly, though, I was going to talk about Lotus Petal and Spirit Guide, Elvish Spirit Guide, because they make mana and they let you cast Skullbriar on turn 1. But weirdly, those cards see almost no play, at least going by EDH Rec, which is so weird because Dark Ritual's in like every Ob Nixilis deck to ramp them out ahead of schedule. Maybe it's because ramping between 2 and 1 doesn't seem significant, but I had them in my deck. I think they're busted. They, changing Skullbriar to coming out on turn 1 makes it ridiculous. It speeds up your clock. I would recommend playing those if you're Skullbriar, but we're not going to talk about them as much because people aren't really playing them. So we'll talk about Hardened Scales, green for an enchantment. People are playing this one. If 1 or more counters we put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters, I love that line of text, are put on it instead. So every time Skullbriar hits or you do whatever, you get it double, so you get 2 instead of 1.
That's just really important because you are trying to burn people out with commander damage. If people can kill this immediately, but you still, immediately, I guess, but you still had 1 counter on it, the fact that it goes from 1 to 2 really might make a difference in the long run, especially if you can bring it out the next turn, because it's so cheap to cast and it's so cheap to keep bringing out, and then just getting those extra counters from hitting people. I think that this is just, I can understand why it's in so many decks. It's just so strong.
Yes, I do want to bust one myth. Some people have been less scared of Skullbriar because, hypothetically, if you put -1 counters on Skullbriar to make his toughness equal 0, that just takes him out forever. I can't conceive of a world where that's even possible or realistic in a game, so I don't count that as a real weakness. If you have something that says put infinity negative counters on a creature, that's pretty cool, but you're never going to get to Yawgmoth this thing when it's a 1/1. That's just not going to happen. So we're really, really scared of commander damage. Bristly Bill is a new one that I didn't get to play because I took the deck apart. 1 and a green 2/2 landfall, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, Skullbriar, and then 3 green, double the number of counters on each creature you control. Just makes Skullbriar a monster almost by itself. If you just go Hardened Scales into Skullbriar into Bristly Bill land drop, oh my god, it's almost game over. You're chipping in for like 5 damage, which just grows and grows over the next few turns. They're in some serious trouble.
There are just so many nasty cards in this deck, one of them being Kodama of the West Tree. 2 and a green for a 3/3 with reach. Modified creatures, which includes +1/+1 counters, you control have trample. Whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land put on the battlefield tap, then shuffle. But that trample's really going to matter because it doesn't matter now if they have a dinky 1/1 to block your 4/4, 6/6, 12/12, whatever Skullbriar, because you're going to be trampling over and that commander damage will stick.
That's the other big thing that Skullbriar is looking to do. They are really looking to get that first connection, which is very easy, and then the next thing they're looking to do is give him trample, so that when he gets huge, you can't throw any counterplay in the way. It doesn't matter what you block with, it's going to jump right over, or you can, sacrifice all your creatures to like save a couple damage. It's not going to go well for you, so they really, really want to give it trample, and then this just has the bonus of ramping you when we're already trying to deal combat damage. Another wrinkle in the Skullbriar deck that makes it very difficult and annoying to deal with is that you don't have to just put +1/+1 counters on him. You can use Unexpected Fangs, which is 1 and a black for an instant, to put a +1/+1 counter and a lifelink counter on target creature, which will be Skullbriar. That also does not go anywhere. It stays no matter where Skullbriar goes. Now, whenever you hit for like 12 or whatever, you're gaining the life, and that kind of means they can't even come back at you with anything.
There's so many cool counters that you can put on Skullbriar that don't leave with Titanoth Rex. So sure, he's a big boy, 11/11, whatever. You're gonna cycle him for 1 and a green and put a trample counter onto Skullbriar so that he has trample no matter where he goes, and that's just gonna stay on. I feel like it's just so tough to deal with this commander because we're usually looking for things like exile, target creature or whatever, but we're never playing things like, oh, put it 4th in your library, and that's the only way to really remove these counters from Skullbriar, or bounce it to your hand.
I think bouncing him back to their hand is one of the only ways to get the counters off, because even if they choose to put it in your deck, you're like, no, I'll put it in the command zone instead. That might be true. I don't remember the rules. I used to know this, but I don't know if they can choose to put it in the command zone instead of their hand. They might still be able to do that. Basically, they're also going to have sack outlets at the ready, so that nothing really weird is going to happen to Skullbriar, and there's not really a way to get rid of the counters. You're going to have to keep it off the battlefield, but it's kind of cheap. Try to develop your board. It's going to be tricky to answer Skullbriar. Make sure you're not the player that gets KO'd first, because with Skullbriar, whether or not you want to play this way, you are incentivized to hit one person to death and then move on to the next person. Once you move on, though, it's really like one hit and you're dead. You farm the first player, you get him up to like 15 counters, and then he's just like a one-hit kill from there. Sack outlets, speaking of, we have Rawls the Scar Striped, 1 and green and black for a 2/2. Each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. The Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost. Let's do a quick refresher on one of the least memorable mechanics ever. Scavenge is exiling a creature card from your graveyard and paying its mana cost to put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to that card's power on target creature. And you can only scavenge as a sorcery, and you can also sacrifice another creature to regenerate Virals. So he's pretty hard to kill. This card is so funny with Skullbriar. What you do is you sacrifice Skullbriar to it, if you want to, you don't have to then pay green-black, scavenge Skullbriar. His power is still augmented by +1/+1 counters while he's in your graveyard. So for 2 mana, you can put like 15 counters on a different creature. Now he's exiled. You put him back in the command zone, and then you just play him again. It's so silly. You can buff up another thing to just have a massive combat turn. I love this goofy little guy. Another quick shout out to maybe the least fun Skullbriar card is Slippery Bogmonder. That puts a hexproof counter. Also has a hilarious name.
I was like, Slippery Bogmonder.
It puts a hexproof counter on Skullbriar. So now it's just impossible to do anything. Once you hit that point, you guys, you need to figure something out.
Plus, as we talked about earlier, one-sided board wipes. Toxic Deluge is basically a one-sided board wipe in here. 2 and a black for a sorcery. It's additional cost to cast it. You pay X life. All creatures get -X until end of turn. But that doesn't matter because you will have the biggest creature with Skullbriar out. So it doesn't matter if you say -6/-6 to all the creatures. You're still going to have this gigantic commander out, and that's just free swings in to a person, and maybe you can kill them.
Yeah, it's not like Toxic Deluge is a bad or obscure card, but I think this is maybe one of the best Toxic Deluge decks I've ever seen, where you just go, my commander is going to kill you with commander damage. Well, I'll get rid of all your blockers. He's still in play. Or even if he's not for some reason, he's got haste if you bring him back. So Skullbriar just an absolute beating. I don't have a ton of advice other than mind your life total. Maybe wait until he's attacking you. Sort of play like a selfish game where you go, look, guys, I'm not going to protect you from being commander damaged out. I'm going to guard myself, wait till he attacks me, then try to get up to some shenanigans.
Yeah, there's no real way to remove counters that is actually viable in commander, so just repeated removal, I guess, and just making sure you're not really wasting it.
Play politics, point the finger at somebody else.
They're scarier than me.
If you're looking for commanders that are a little less scary and a little bit more unbeatable, this video might be very helpful for you.